Howdy folks, welcome to the Daily Coin. My name is Rory and today is Monday, December the 24th, 2018. And first of all, I want to wish everyone a very Merry Christmas. And this is a continuation of the conversation that I started with Louis Camerosano the other day. And this is we're going to cover all things geopolitical, and we really appreciate you being here today. But I really want to get your input. I've been one of very few people that have reported on the Belt and Road coming to Panama. It's coming into Central America. Said there's very little reporting on it. And this has just happened since the G20 when Xi Jinping was in Argentina. He took a excursion to Panama. They signed 28 different agreements for infrastructure and banking, finance, and this is just to name a few of the areas of significance. One of the things that they did as well, what China did was they took a direct flight away from LAX and gave it to Panama. So one of those routes that used to fly out of Beijing into LA is now gone, and it goes into Panama instead. And I know that you've had some different ideas about the Belt and Road Initiative, and correct me if I'm wrong, Louis, but I think that you see it more as a Ponzi scheme. But this is now getting serious. I mean, because now the Belt and Road is literally in our backyard. I mean, 28 different agreements for infrastructure, banking, finance. They're now opening up banks in Panama where you can now use the yuan currency. It's impacting the Federal Reserve notes that are being circulated in Panama. They're making different currency moves. What do you see? Is this significant or is this nothing?
It's significant for Panama, not so much for China. And the significance is in many of the Belt and Road initiatives that they started out, the early agreements, many of them have been canceled or renegotiated because they're seen as a debt trap. You have Pakistan pulling out. You've had Malaysia pulling out of a multi-billion-dollar rail project. Just the new president came in and just like Trump said, this is a bad deal. We're not going to do it. In fact, the Panamanian Belt and Road deals, Pompeo's out there warning that, and other nations, that when China comes calling, it's not always for the good of your citizens. So these are debt-driven projects. And the reason China needs to do them is their internal economy is indeed slowing down and may have been set into an acceleration of decline due to these tariffs. China's own internal reporting on bad debt internally in many industries, they say non-performing loans are 40 to 50%. And a lot of people say, oh, well, they owe it to themselves. You can't have it both ways. We owe a lot of money to ourselves and unfunded liabilities, and it is a problem. You can't just say, oh, well, that's Social Security. Well, we just owe that to ourselves. We'll just print it up. What China is trying to do, and very smartly, is to gain not so much, I think, economic influence, but economic assets through defaulting on a lot of these. So they could end up owning a port in Panama if whatever they build, the Panamanians can't pay back. And I think that's been their strategy, is to go into Africa and try to get as much resources and access to resources that they can, try to gain a foothold throughout the world. The problem of the Belt and Road as being something of a danger to the dollar, I don't see, because the Chinese yuan is always subject to devaluation. They need to have it not internationalized so that they can just print up yuan and write off bad loans and so on. So the interest is really, it's geopolitical, I think, more than financial. And again, the United States is competing with the Belt and Road with the Quad, which is Japanese, Australian, and India. You always think of the BRICS as being on the Chinese side, but in this instance, India is also wary of China's Belt and Road initiatives and of their resources up in the north where they have a dispute with China. So I think that the Belt and Road is a danger to the United States because it has the potential. China comes calling with infrastructure projects, loans, and so on, and some of the countries take them up on it. But we're seeing, at least in the initial projects in Southeast Asia, that there has been a turn on the Chinese in this, and now it looks like they're trying to pull this out in Panama. And we have seen a U.S. reaction with Pompeo warning Panamanians about this. That doesn't mean that warning will go heated. It may go unheated, but it's definitely worth and commend you for reporting on it because it is an important thing to consider. China is trying to, a lot of people think that China has one goal, that's to buy gold. They have many goals. They have, and it's to internationalize the yuan, but they have them prioritized. And they also know their number one goal is to keep the wheels on of their domestic economy. And to the extent they can multitask, they clearly will. And also, worked in a company once where they kind of knew the end of the game was coming, and they try to go out and buy a lot of companies. And it seems like what China's doing is, look, if this thing isn't going to work out internationally, we should have gold. We should have resource access. We should have our footprint outside of the country so that if our internal economy collapses, we at least can call on some of these other alliances, relationships, assets that we have. So I think it's somewhat of it's a danger to those that take on the Chinese because the Chinese are at the moment a more powerful position than a lot of these less developed nations that are accepting the Chinese loans. So what the Quad is doing is they're kind of going in and trying to they say they'll either undercut the Chinese deal, meaning put it on better terms than this is China. I mean, this is United States, India, Australia, and Japan. Give better terms on some of these infrastructure deals, or provide bridge financing where many of the Chinese deals aren't working out, or just bid them up so that China can't get a good deal and then they have to walk away from it. So it's definitely, I think if we didn't have the Trump administration and neocons like Bolton, and I'm not saying Pompeo is, but they're much more interested in preserving U.S. hegemony than the Obama administration was. And they do see this as a threat. Whereas I think when China was out doing these deals 5-7 years ago, and we were talking about de-dollarization, I don't think the United States was paying any much attention to it at all. And it's interesting, you see the mainstream media now never talked about de-dollarization, never talked about all this kind of stuff. And now that it looks like it's happening, I see the mainstream media is almost to put a thumb in Trump's eye. They talk about the rise of China, when actually the rise of China was a bigger threat, I think, 3 to 5 years ago when they were signing up a lot of these contracts and on the Belt and Road, and there were no problems with them. We're seeing the Belt and Road and China's internal economy not doing as well as it was 3 to 5 years ago, and it's a function of debt. China's not immune to a debt Ponzi scheme any more than the United States is. And I think there's not enough attention focused on the fact that China has issued more debt than the United States, Europe, and Japan combined in the last 7 years. They are the debt kings right now. And no one's really pays attention to China or really looks at the full picture.
Well, it's funny that you bring that up about about corporate media bringing the China problem to the table. I mean, Tucker Carlson reports on it all the time, but more interesting, on the Bloomberg channel, they actually have at least a 3-part series of it. And I just saw it the other day, and it's called Belt and Road. And when I was flipping through the guide and saw this title, this Belt and Road, and it's like, what's that? Click on there, and sure enough, that's what it's about. I haven't watched it yet. I've got the episode 3 on DVR, and I'm going to watch it to see how they're reporting this. But you're right, Lewis, in that you and I were, when we were doing all those shows 2 or 3 years ago, we talked a lot about the Belt and Road. Nobody
Longer.
is hardly
D
talking
D
about
dollar
it.
de-dollarization 3 4 years ago we were talking about it.
Huge. I mean, and we spent a lot of time and spilled a lot of ink over that. We're not doing that anymore.
No, and it had at that point it had gone unchecked. But see, it's like any narrative.
Completely.
That narrative continues on as if nothing has changed in the last 4 years. And
Right.
now Bloomberg, AP, Reuters are all now touting this as the biggest threat to the United States. And maybe the threat has somewhat receded.
I would say that it is definitely not as in your face as it was, like
Right.
you said, 3 to 5 years ago. I mean, it was definitely a serious threat. And speaking of which, what
I'm
I
sorry,
see,
they were on the move, and this is before we learned about all the Chinese social credit scores, the
right?
concentration camps.
Yep.
People were like cheering on China, like good for them. Now people say, "Whoa, China's not your gold buddy. China's not your buddy at all."
No, they're not. Um, One of the theses that I've been working on for most of 2018 is what's happening in Russia. I have different ideas about the reasoning behind the Russia did it narrative that is so prolific in the corporate media. It's twofold actually, and the main thing and the second piece of it is just now really starting to unfold, even though it's been in place for the past 2 years. And that is their food production. Since the Obama administration instituted sanctions, economic sanctions against Russia, they had to look internally and start developing different systems and different manufacturing for themselves. One of the main ones was food. And one of the situations that Russia actually stepped up and said, we don't want any more of your GMO nonsense. We're going to grow our own. We're going to figure something else out. And they've been going through this process of developing the largest organic and non-GMO food farms in the world. And I see that as one of the biggest threats to the West that could possibly be, because it's not fully developed at this point, but they're working on it. They're very vocal about it. They've invited 15,000 of the white South African farmers to Russia. You can come here. We'll help you get here. We'll help you out. Everything. You just name it. Tell us what you need. We'll get you here and get you set up. That's huge. You know, as you are well aware, I'm sure, Lewis, that of the situation that's happening in South Africa, the white farmers are being slaughtered mercilessly.
What's
And
you
go ahead.
What's interesting about Russia, and Russia doesn't get enough attention because Russia's only been talked about as somehow all that Russia is interested in is interfering in our elections. So that's what happens when a narrative takes place, and you don't realize all the other things they're doing. Just like in the gold community, it's China's buying gold as if that's all they're doing. Those aren't their main goals in their national goals. The the key to Russia's food production is they've moved from, if you go historically, Russia used to be, during the Soviet Union, always at risk of starvation. And if you recall, because I am as at least old as you, Rory, the Great Grain Robbery, I think it was in the early 70s, is when Russia had to buy wheat from the United States at subsidized prices. It was like the Iran deal. It was horrendous. It caused higher grain prices in the U.S., and Russia managed to buy a lot of wheat from the U.S. at lower prices. And it highlighted that they did not have the technology. They had, you've got the Ukraine, you have many areas, they're the breadbasket of Europe. They weren't able to farm. And over the last 10, 15 years, they've become an exporter of food. And now they're moving into non GMO food. And again, this is outside of the idea that Russia's buying gold and Russia's stacking for the collapse. Russia's doing a lot of things. Every country's doing a lot of things. It's not just about a gold and Belt and Road, and so it's a very big. And also, it's geopolitical. You know,
Right.
you're bringing people from South Africa into Russia, people on the move. You have human interest stories. It's amazing how once you get involved in just looking at things through the perspective of gold or the perspective of silver, how limited your view is. And I appreciate you bring these, GMO foods uh, that the rise of organic foods is an entirely different type of analysis, but it fits into what countries are doing as part of their national plans. So it's very interesting what's going on, and you would always thought that Russia used to be dependent on external sources for food, and now maybe they may be dependent on external farmers for some additional know-how. But that has changed, and Russia. People think of Russia and China. Oh, they're both buying gold, and therefore they're the same. They're not. They're not even really allies. They have totally separate interests in the world. They have totally separate economies. Russia's is not built on debt. That's the
Exactly.
amazing
That's
thing
the
about.
important part, and that's huge.
It's not a consumer export driven. They're basically their biggest exports are oil, and now food are big exports. And it's not based. And the other thing is, unlike China, Russia has very little trade with the United States for a variety of reasons. We don't need their oil, but also we have them under sanctions. But China is integrated with that export economy, and people act like, oh, they'll just stop sending it to the United States for paper, and they'll just consume it themselves. It's not that easy. Russia is actually in a shape where they're used to historically. I mean, they lost 50. I don't know how many million men they lost. They had a man shortage into the 70s because of World War II. They are used to horrific times. And, what's a little sanctions as long as bombs aren't dropping and you don't have Germans invading your country? I think they probably feel like they have life relatively good. I mean,
Yes.
compared
Compared to
to.
those two scenarios, yes,
Right,
life is
right.
pretty good.
Yeah. So, I think that the problem that China has is you've got hundreds of millions of people have moved in from the Netherlands, of not the Netherlands, not from Holland and Bruges and stuff, but moved in from outside, out in the countryside, and moved into these mega cities that didn't exist 10, 15 years ago. Now have
Right.
5, 8, 10, 12 million people in them. China's got a problem if they can't keep them there and keep them employed. Russia doesn't have that problem. They didn't borrow
No.
a lot of money and build a lot of skyscrapers and move half their population into cities.
Right, and this is now you're hitting on the point that I really wanted to drive home, and that is that Russia is focused internally and developing what they need in order to be a debt-free society. They have some debt, but not much, and they are developing themselves. They are building themselves to be a power, not a superpower, but to be able to take care of themselves. And the sanctions that have been instigated against them by the West has been the best thing to ever happen to them, unlike what's been happening with China.
They can't
And
deal with it. They're
they
right.
they
So,
cannot deal with it because everything and look at what they're doing, like what you've been pointing out, and I didn't see the Belt and Road as being a Ponzi scheme. I'm kind of moving in that direction. I haven't bought off on that fully yet, but China is looking externally at everything, where Russia is looking internally at
right.
everything, and but these two nations they are integrated by at least two mega economic alliances, and that's the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as well
Mm-hmm.
as the BRICS alliance. So and their financial and banking systems are integrated with one another. So there
and
is,
and they have gold sales. Yeah, sure, they have
yes,
trade amongst
yes,
themselves, absolutely. But Russia has never viewed historically China as a friendly. This is the closest they've ever been. Normally, they are their enemies. Even during the communist period, the Soviet Union and Mao's China were not big buddies. So this has changed. But again, political alliances are not just from history, but through necessity. And because they now have totally different economies, they may not have the same type of need that they might have had when they were both communist countries. But even though they were not big alliance, even when they were both communist. But Russia is international pariah in some respects because they are doing this non New World Order, this nationalistic type
Yes.
of economy, which is what Trump has been trying to push, rather than this globalist trade going back and forth and more of the interest going to the third world and allowing the third world to catch up. Whereas the nationalists say, we don't really care about the third world. It's not that we don't care about them, but we hope that they do well for themselves. But our first priority is to do well for ourselves.
Exactly. And that's
And
and that's another big part of what's happening in Russia. And part of my ongoing thesis is that the nationalistic aspect of Russia, and part of that is there is the spiritual component. I mean, this is a massive Orthodox Christian nation to the point of building 3 churches a day, and they're still at 100% capacity. So when you combine what they're doing with the food, looking at their nationalistic uh, outlook, and the spiritual component of what they are as a people, to me, this is the foundation for the Russia did it narrative that we are constantly fed here in the West, because all 3 of these are exactly what the globalists hate. That trinity that Russia stands on is the antithesis of what the New World Order globalist scumbags want to unfurl. Or
well, if
am I just wrong?
no, well, if you look at, again, as I mentioned, the cheerleading of China in the mainstream media like Bloomberg, AP, and Reuters, it's the exact opposite of what they say about Russia. In other words,
Exactly.
they're saying my Belt and Road and China is going to do this and the yuan is, and they're not looking at the numbers. The yuan is not increased internationally as a reserve asset in the last 5 years. It's just not happening.
So it's
But
actually losing ground, isn't it? I
yeah,
thought that,
as
yeah, yeah.
well, why would you want to hold a currency that you know they will devalue if they have to? And you know they're going to have to. So what's the point in holding it just to de-dollarize? But you see, it's interesting. That used to be a gold narrative 4 or 5 years ago when it somewhat made sense when China's debt was less than half of what it is now.
Right.
But now it's become a mainstream narrative, and I think it's because I don't know if you've ever heard the interview I did with gentleman we were talking about. He was saying that that China was actually part of the whole globalist plan, and they're not like the separate entity, that they're tied in. That's why they want to be in the SDR. Sure, China wants to have its own independence, but Russia is clearly outside of all these plans.
Yes, they are outside. And China has, and yeah, James Corbett made that argument years ago, as far as, and he actually, detailed everything. There's a great interview that James Corbett did with Sean over at SGT Report
Mm-hmm.
on that topic about China is simply a different horse in the same race, and that the globalists are, who have no loyalty to anyone except for themselves. They are simply changing horses mid-race. They're moving from the west to the east, and that's the
Right, right.
reason that all of this is unfolding the way that it is.
So why? So if you think about it, why is Trump going against China? Because he views them as globalists.
Exactly.
He's not.
He sees them
He's
as the
not.
enemy.
That's right. That's right. So very interesting.
It is very interesting. Well, Lewis, we could go on for the rest of the day, I believe, but
But we're not going to.
we probably should cut it off right here. But I now that I'm dusting off my channel, I'd really love to have you back on a more regular basis. We can have these conversations to keep everything in front of people the way that we were couple of years ago. And like I said,
Oh, great.
I've been in semi-retirement from doing videos, but that's now changed, and I'm going to be back doing them again because I have a different uh, outlook on a lot of things. But anyway, I really
All right. Well,
appreciate.
would be delighted then, Rory.
What's that?
Would be delighted to do that.
Well, I hope so, and I really appreciate all the time and the great analysis that you've given. Because one of the things that I really respect about you and your work is the fact that you don't really care what other people are saying or are what they're selling, basically. And that's the point that I've reached as well. It's like it's not important. The only thing that matters is the truth, and that's it. And
Try to get at it wherever it leads you. I don't like to start from the point is how is this news good for gold or silver?
yes,
Maybe
where
it isn't. Maybe it has nothing to do with gold or silver.
probably not. It probably doesn't have anything to do with gold and silver, just like the organic and non-GMO food that Russia's producing.
Right.
Not gold and silver related in the least.
Someone will figure out that some of the farm equipment might have small amounts of nanoparticles of silver, and that'll be the story.
It'll be the game changer.
Yes, exactly. New demand for silver in Russian non-GMO farming. Silver set to skyrocket.
Huge nanoparticles.
Yes, 18 ounces a year demand added.
Just for apples. But
Yeah, yeah.
I know you do an every night at 7 or 7:30.
7:38, depending on when I wake up. That's a joke. Yeah, in the evening. Yes, every
It's
night.
every
Small
night
goal live stream.
live stream. Yep, and that's
And
Monday through Friday.
yeah, and then what I do is I try to get it up on Real Video and BitChute as well. And I know you've been kind enough to repost those on the Daily Coin.
Yep, I repost as much as I can, and I appreciate the analysis and I really appreciate the fact that you're on BitChute because I want to republish more work from BitChute because I want to support that platform more so than this YouTube. But we didn't even get into that, and it's on my agenda, so we'll pick that up on the next conversation. But I really appreciate everything, Lewis, and you can find all of Lewis's work over at Small Gold, and that's SMAULGLD.com. And Lewis, thank you so much.
Thank you, Rory. Thank you, everyone.